What has been quite a magnificent and also formidable conference during this time with a great deal of experts. I also apologize for my own insecurities. There is a handout that I'll be speaking to. There's a small stack of it on each table. And I wanted to speak to two sort of broad general points. One is, first of all, that as Elaine Bunn has said time after time after time, and I'm pleased to be able to echo her, is that deterrence is a lot more than just nuclear deterrence. It's many, many things. It's a broad range of things. But also to talk about, at this time, what makes for credibility. And the point that I wanted to make, and the reason why I've handed out this schematic, is that when talking about deterrence and talking about assurance, we're used to thinking about, as the Perry Schlesinger Commission pointed out, deterrence is in the eyes of the beholder, as is assurance. And it's the perceptions of those you are seeking to deter and the perceptions of those you're seeking to assure that matter. Many of you may be familiar with what people call the Healy theorem, which was from a defense minister in the UK during the Cold War, who made the point that, all we have to do to convince the Soviets to be deterred is that there's a probability of 1 out of 5 that we might do something. But our allies, they need 90%. The differences, standards for credibility on assurance as opposed to deterrence is quite different. But the point that I wanted to make here as well, and try to make it briefly before we go to questions, is that there's more than one audience or two audiences, there's a third audience. And not many people pay attention to what is the impact of our statements, U.S. statements, on both assurance and on deterrence and extended deterrence, upon what I refer to as the American audience, our top officials, the Congress in particular, and the American people who are less involved on a day-to-day basis, but who periodically do get involved in these kind of questions. And the reason why I would point out the importance of the American audience in looking forward to the credibility of our future assurances and deterrence, extended deterrence commitments, is to note the striking difference between the speeches that Secretary Gates made at the outset of his recent trip at Shangri-La in Asia, and then at the conclusion of his trip at a NATO ministerial, which was quite different. In Asia, he was talking about the enduring commitment of the United States to the security of Asia, stating again and again how important it had become. Used a term that I frankly was stunned to see him use, but he quoted Madeleine Albright as saying, the United States really is viewed in Asia as the indispensable nation, as part of the solutions to the security problems and challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners in Asia, and saying that he was again surprised and pleased at the extent to which that had grown over the 4.5 years that he was in office, and his conviction that it would continue to grow because our security partnerships in Asia are very important. And then he makes a few other stops, and he comes out in Europe. And the first thing he does is beat up on the defense ministers for cutting and running in Afghanistan, that everybody's talking about running for the exits rather than staying and finishing the job. And then, in his final, what he described as his final policy statement, and I'm sure many of his cabinet colleagues, like Secretary Clinton, are quite happy that it's his final policy statement at this time, he absolutely lambasts the Europeans for failing to continue to bear their fair share, noting that since 9/11, which has been a time of heightened security concerns for the United States share of NATO's spending had increased from 50% of the total to 75% of the total, and that the European allies were demonstrating in Libya right now of their inability to conduct and sustain even the most modest of military exercises. And essentially saying is, I'm concerned that if NATO Europe doesn't start pulling itself together, that NATO as an alliance will face a dismal, if not dim, future, and raise the issue, which I raised in an earlier meeting today, that the American people are going to look at this and say to themselves, is there really a transatlantic bargain here? I heard one of my European counterparts argue that NATO has extraordinary conventional superiority now. That's not true. The United States has enormous conventional superiority over Russia, not NATO Europe. NATO Europe, it's always been a problem in terms of the free rider problem. It is a much greater problem now. And so that I would argue that in terms of contrasting, as we talk about the credibility of our assurances, the credibility of extended deterrence assurances, it really depends upon the broader security relationship and the fact that when you look at Asia, as you see from Bob Gates, a very tough-minded guy facing serious decisions, is that he looks at it and he sees my Asian partners, my Asian allies are carrying their weight. They understand the security problems the same way we do, and our security interests in that area will be enduring, thereby greatly enhancing, I would argue, the credibility of the commitments that we make. Even though the threat environment in Asia is probably a good deal more severe than the threat environment in Europe, nevertheless, the credibility of our statements there, and then contrast that with the statements that Secretary Gates made in Brussels on his way out the door. Thank you.
Thanks, Clark, for getting us off to a great start. I was just at a U.S.-China dialogue where one of the Chinese participants said that he was very concerned about the strengthening of especially the Japan-Korea relationship because he was concerned about the possibility of an Asian NATO. And I immediately thought, what are you worrying about? They're running out of bombs in NATO, so that's not really much of a threat. Now I'd like to turn to Elaine Bond.
Thanks, Scott. I'm going to focus my remarks on conventional prompt global strike because it's a concept that's bandied around a lot, but more, I think, more smoke than light on it in a lot of conversations. For a number of years across two different U.S. administrations, the U.S. has been considering the concept of conventional prompt global strike, or CPGS. It's a concept that calls for a U.S. capability to deliver conventional strikes almost anywhere in the world in approximately an hour. I'll briefly address the reasons the U.S. is considering CPGS, some of the issues that opponents raise, what the program looks like over the next few years, and how CPGS might be handled in the U.S.-China and U.S.-Russia context. But first, let me underscore that CPGS is a concept. It's in research and development. It is not deployed. It is not even an acquisition. So keep that in mind as we go through. The logic of CPGS, I think, is pretty straightforward, that the U.S. has global security commitments to deter and respond to a whole diverse spectrum of threats, particularly those emanating from terrorist organizations and nuclear-armed regional states. The thinking is that high-value targets might pop up without warning in remote or sensitive areas, potentially precluding the U.S. from responding by employing other conventional weapon systems or deploying special operations forces or relying on the host country. Or it might be that the U.S. needed to strike a time-sensitive target protected by formidable air defense or located deep inside enemy territory. Now, a long-range nuclear-armed ballistic missile does have the speed and global reach to overcome those obstacles, but I think a president would probably prefer conventional strikes to have that option as an alternative to nuclear weapons in most contingencies. In fact, many advocates of CPGS of the concept argue that it would provide a new capability for scenarios in which existing conventional capabilities are insufficient, but in which the use of nuclear weapons would be inappropriate. Additionally, in many potential crises, a nuclear threat might lack credibility in the eyes of the beholder, whether that beholder is an adversary or an ally, regardless of the U.S. president's willingness to use nuclear weapons. So from that standpoint, advocates would argue that a long-range conventional strike capability can enhance deterrence and assurance by providing an effective and more usable, and thus more credible strike option. For those reasons, a conventional weapon that is faster, travels farther, is more effective against air defenses than existing conventional forces could be a valuable strategic asset. And that's why, if you think about it, that's why two administrations as different as this one and the previous one have both argued for pursuing such a capability. On the other hand, there are arguments against it. Some have argued that U.S. conventional sea-launched ballistic missiles or intercontinental range ballistic missiles would be destabilizing weapons, and in fact, Congress withheld funding necessary for the last administration to develop and deploy conventional Trident D5 missiles on Ohio-class submarines due to concerns that Russian officials might misinterpret a U.S. CPGS launch as a nuclear attack. However, that whole argument is now a moot point because the U.S. is no longer exploring ballistic missile CPGS, but only boost glide concepts, which glide in the atmosphere for most of their flight path, giving them a distinctly non-ballistic trajectory. Skeptics also argue that CPGS weapons would likely be unusable because the U.S. would lack the necessary intelligence to employ them against fleeting targets, and that if the U.S. did have actionable intelligence, that other conventional assets would be within range of the target. As a result of all these arguments for and against, there's really no clear consensus within Congress and the broader U.S. national security community about whether the U.S. Should acquire and deploy CPGS capabilities. So what does the program look like over the next few years? DoD really has not made any decisions about system concepts, basing strategies, acquisition programs for conventional prompt global strike. The current activities are focused on developing and demonstrating technologies that would eventually enable boost glide concepts. They characterize the current activity as event-based, which means that the results of flight tests will inform engineering and investment decisions in the future. There was one flight test that occurred in 2010. Depending on who you listen to, it was either not at all successful or it had a little bit of success, but it depends on who you listen to. And two more are planned for 2011. And those tests are designed to collect booster launch data and hypersonic glide data that could be applicable to a whole broad range of CPGS technologies and system configurations. And those flight tests and how they come out will be critical to deciding how to go forward or whether to go forward. I would note that long-range boost glide concepts will pose both a really big technology challenge and cost challenges as well. And really that's an understatement, to put it that way. So, strategic stability dialogues with Russia and China, as you know, those were proposed in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review report, which states that dialogues with Russia and China to facilitate more stable, resilient, and transparent strategic relationships were something that the administration wanted. They've acknowledged that Russia and China are concerned about the conventional prompt global strike concept, even though I think most would say a modest number, a boutique capability, which is what's being talked about. A modest number of CPGS weapons would not enable the U.S. to rapidly degrade certainly Russia's large force and even China's smaller strategic force with conventional weapons. However, Russia and Chinese officials have certainly said the CPGS concept they see it as a first strike, as an effort at first strike capability, and it would undermine strategic stability. So, I do think that strategic stability dialogues are the right place to have discussions about potential future U.S. CPGS deployments, explaining the role and what kind of situations they might be used in and so forth. It seems to me that pre-launch notifications of CPGS could be a useful starting point for U.S.-China or U.S.-Russia discussion of CPGS. The U.S. and China obviously have a formal military-to-military hotline, but they don't really have much experience using it, and I'm not sure that the U.S. officials necessarily assume that they'd be able to promptly reach their Chinese counterparts in a crisis. So I think it's worth trying to develop a mutually recognized set of procedures for CPGS launch notification with China, and maybe they could start with exercises where the U.S. notified CPGS use against a terrorist target, for instance. But I also think that Russian and Chinese concerns about the impact of CPGS reflect a larger trend, which is that the military balance between U.S. and Russia on one hand and China on the other encompasses a broader set of capabilities than just nuclear. Also, as Clark said, also is about conventional weapons, non-nuclear strike, cyber and space capabilities, which I haven't heard mentioned at this conference much at all, missile defenses as well. I do think that eliminating completely Russian and Chinese concerns about CPGS or any of these other capabilities is probably unrealistic, but attenuating, mitigating them is probably within the doable do. So let me conclude by reminding you again that conventional prompt global strike is a concept. It's a glint in the eye of some planners. It's in research and development. It hasn't been deployed. It's not an acquisition. The Obama administration has decided not to pursue CPGS based on existing ballistic missiles like SLBMs and ICBMs with conventional warheads. And the remaining options for it are all based on boost glide versions of technology that is years away. Thanks.
Thanks, Elaine. I think that presentation raises some very interesting questions about whether conventional capabilities can serve to help marginalize the role of nuclear weapons in the context of deterrence. We are now going to switch to Brad Glosterman, Pacific Forum CSIS. And Brad, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Scott. Let me try to provide some broad conceptual issues, perhaps, or not, that were raised by the two previous presentations. And let me say thanks to the organizers, and how fortunate I am to be flanked by these two, who I just think do outstanding work, and I think you're really lucky to have them here on this panel. I would highly, highly recommend both Clark's study on extended deterrence, which will be the focus of my remarks. It came out last year. Outstanding job. And then Elaine's new study on conventional prompt global strike, which came out by NDU Press a couple of months ago, which, too, I think just define the field. I'm going to focus on extended deterrence, which is, as somebody said, is essentially political, only more so. And I think Clark got at the frame and the focus and the reassurance issues, which is to some degree what I want to talk about. I come at this based on a series of strategic dialogues we've run with the U.S. ROK and the U.S. and Japan, 2 with the South Koreans, 3 with the Japanese. The next round of each will be held later this month. And then 2 tours that we did, interestingly enough, of Japan and South Korea. We ended up speaking to about 800 people in South Korea over a week, talking about the alliance and about deterrence and nuclear weapons, and about 600 people in Japan. So that's where I'm drawing from. And clearly the distinction that we're discussing between conventional and nuclear deterrence is taking on new salience, obviously, as Clark notes in his notes, about after President Obama's speech, and I think in light as well of the development of new capabilities, prompt global strike being among them, that give us a wider range of opportunities and ways to respond. And this has implications later, which I'll come back to. And of course, we need to remember, as always has to be noted, that while the United States may be committed to the eventual achievement of global zero in whoever's lifetime we're talking about, nevertheless, it remains the bottom line for U.S. planning that, of course, we will keep nuclear weapons as long as nuclear weapons remain a threat. As long as our adversaries have them, so will we. So we don't, just keep that in mind. Our research shows that in this area, and I think in this part of the world in Northeast Asia, and if you've listened to any of the panels, I think over the last couple of days, you'll hear that there is a concern about state actors. And I think that this is an important distinction that we frequently miss in the United States, although some of the thinking may have shifted in the last 6-8 months, particularly after what's happened in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, that the nations and the countries and the governments here are more worried about state actors, I think, than necessarily the non-state actors and the non-proliferation issues that the United States has put so much of its energy on, particularly in the aftermath of September 11. There's a real concern here for what Sugio Takahashi yesterday called shaping the strategic environment, and that's very much a function of state players. Now that in itself also introduces some new and interesting twists. And that is that in some ways it's not just a military response, and it's not just a military question. And I think we get to that when, I think Elaine, you may have alluded to it a minute ago, in the comment about rare earth. One of the things that I was most struck by in the discussions last year was in the aftermath of the Senkaku's Diaoyutai incident, what the Japanese interlocutors told us was that they were more struck by the actual use of the rare earths embargo than it was necessarily the collision of the ships and the brunt use of military force. That implies, within the context of shaping strategic environments, the need to use a much broader array of tools, which I think then means that a military response is not the only mechanism by which we need to be thinking about deterrence and about assurance. And now that seems to me to raise two subsidiary questions as well. The first is, it brings to mind what Elaine just said about the significance of strategic assets broadly defined. And I mean, whether we're talking military or even more beyond military, we talk about cyber, we talk about space, but as well, I think we need to be talking about economic, political instruments of power, too. And as a subsidiary issue or a related issue, and I put this out on the table just for some discussion later, in my discussions with Chinese interlocutors, there has been a real concern that U.S. allies do not understand how deterrence works. And consequently, there is a fear among the Chinese that our allies want us to be brandishing nuclear threats to reassure them and creating greater instability. And there is, very simply put, the Chinese seem to us, or to me at least, to be concerned about the tail wagging the dog. Now, it strikes me that there is an understandable concern on the part of U.S. allies about the changes in nuclear posture, given the way that we insisted for so long that nuclear weapons were absolutely essential to our defense of East Asia. And I think all the confusion surrounding the Tomahawk debate and the decommissioning of that really goes to that. And it occurs to me similarly, it is no longer clear to me, and perhaps they can correct me or you can, the degree to which that nuclear weapons are more important to U.S. allies than it is necessarily to our adversaries. And I think that clearly that element came out yesterday in the discussion of Japan, if you were there for that. I seem, from the way that I'm looking at it these days, that the changes in U.S. nuclear policy, in fact, reinforce deterrence by, I think, deepening and strengthening our ties with our allies. And this goes precisely to Clark's issue of reassurance. That as we move away from a nuclear capability or a reliance so much on nuclear capability, we in fact depend more upon our allies. And I think that those strengthened ties simultaneously become more credible and at the same time reassure both our allies and our potential adversaries that we are so deeply integrated that an attack on one is an attack upon the other. And so, at a certain level, we blur, if you will, the notions of deterrence and reassurance. Now, I know the theorists among you were probably going to throw things at me, but I make no claim to theory. And I think clearly our allies can be doing more for our alliances And I think that this can reconfirm the bond, and the discussions of ballistic missile defenses, I think, really in some ways go to the very heart of that. And the way that we integrate our systems and the way that we rely upon them and rely upon our allies clearly ties us closer together. Clark also got at, I think, the new economic realities that compel these deeper ties. And the fact of the matter is that we have entered a new economic era. And the U.S. budgets have to change. And at a recent meeting, someone said that we need to think about the United States, Japan, and our European allies as an integrated economic system, or our alliances. And that the idea somehow or other we're going to be able to pass costs off from one center to the other is mistaken. We're all in a new economic world, and we all have to find efficiencies. And that, I think, increases our inclination, our absolute necessity of finding new efficiencies, of working together, figuring out ways to better apportion burdens such that we can still continue to do things that we consider technical, or that we consider essential. Now, as we move clearly to a more conventional deterrent, I think we're going to discover that there are some capabilities that are beyond our allies' ability to either afford or to acquire. That's okay. And I think we have to acknowledge that, but certainly not all. And finally, in what has probably been a somewhat incoherent discussion, I want to also suggest, and I think Elaine's discussion of prompt global strike goes to some of this, that we need to be worried about new doctrines that may, in fact, as we move to a conventional capability, prove to be more destabilizing. I'm worried in this sense about the proliferation of what I call offensive strike capabilities. And the capabilities aren't necessarily there, but there are discussions in Japan, there are discussions here, discussions in Taiwan. And I think we need to think very, very hard about how we walk down this path and what the implications are. And I would, as a final remark, note that one of the things that has surprised and frankly scared me is the utter lack of strategic understanding in both of these countries, apart from an extremely small community, of the implications of changes in doctrine and the changes of acquisitions. And it's dangerous. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Just to offer some remarks to try to, I don't know if I'm going to tie this together or not, but it seems to me that we've heard about multiple audiences. I think also there are some multiple messages. And what I'm thinking about is the difference between the declaratory message of President Obama in aiming for a world without nuclear weapons in contrast to maybe the messages that people might take from the NPR, which doesn't disavow that as an objective, but it definitely puts it into a different kind of context as one deals with the details. And then I think another theme from this discussion is really the impact on alliances. And so I want to ask two questions to the panelists before I open it up to everybody else. One is precisely on what are the messages that allies and adversaries should take from the Prague speech in combination with the NPR. And then a second question, which may really be focused primarily to Elaine, is conventional prompt global strike, conceptual, but what do you think is the impact on alliances of that particular concept? And we'll go in the same order to answer my question, and then we'll mix it up once we get out to the audience.
Okay, well, I'm not going to address the issue of conventional precision guided strike.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's Elaine's. But I will speak a little bit about the Prague speech in NPR. It's important not to look at just the Prague speech of the NPR. NPR is one of many activities and results of what I would say is President Obama's nuclear agenda. It started with the Prague speech, the Prague agenda. But even before that, it was the opening of negotiations for a New START, where they came in with the opening position of what the force structures could look like on the U.S. side. So it's New START, it's Prague speech, it's Ballistic Missile Defense Review, which began in September with a decision to abandon the previous administration's National Missile Defense System, the third site, so-called third site, and then go to the phased adaptive approach. and a series of things leading to the NPR and the QDR as well. So there are a number of elements to this policy, and it's not just the NPR by itself. There are delicate balances being struck by what are messages that appear contradictory. A commitment to reduce the role of nuclear weapons as necessary to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. I mean, from a U.S. perspective, explaining to our own people, well, how can we do with fewer nuclear weapons? Well, we need fewer nuclear weapons, so you reduce the role of it. At the same time, there is a revitalization of the U.S. nuclear infrastructure with investment in the facilities, the physical plants, and in the people who man them, with the investment in maintaining a safe, secure, and effective arsenal. So there's contradictory messages there that you have to look at the totality of the messages to say, is the Obama administration seriously committed to the pursuit of a world without nuclear weapons? Well, I think when you look at their actions, yes, they're continuing to try to push forward on how do you do the next round of negotiations with the Russians. I'm not very optimistic about it, but Tom Donilon gave a speech at the end of March, the National Security Advisor, where he went back to the Prague agenda and said, these are the 4 elements of the Prague agenda, and look at the progress we've made, and we're going to continue to work it. So I think, and he made very clear that President Obama is personally committed to this, and that it is his involvement that has led to this period of activity on the nuclear front. So I think he is personally involved, but he has to balance competing demands, which means sometimes he gives off competing messages.
All I'll say on the Prague speech is it's one of those that everybody likes half of it. On CPGS and alliances, well, if we actually deploy it, it could enhance deterrence in that both allies and adversaries. In order to extend deterrence, you have to be able to deter whoever your allies are worried about. Okay, so you worry about adversaries and you worry about assuring allies. And it could be seen in the eyes of both beholders as more credible that we would use it. And so in that sense, it might enhance assurance and enhance deterrence. Though, I do also hear allies concerned about what opponents of CPGS say, which is, well might they think it's a nuclear strike? Basically the talk that I gave today on the issue of multiple audiences. The talk I gave today is the same one that I gave in Track 2 dialogue with the Chinese last week in Honolulu. And I guess my message was, you can worry about and react to CPGS if you want to, but it's way premature. So in that sense, we're trying to reassure or mitigate concerns on the parts of China and Russia. We're trying to reassure allies. And then we're trying to give other messages to the likes of North Korea and Iran. It's really hard having multiple audiences.
Brad?
It's tough being a superpower. The only thing I guess I would add is just that from my vantage point, there is an extraordinary amount of effort to consult with Asian allies, to consult with them, to keep them informed, to reassure them. And that the messages, as both Clark and Elaine said, I think are not muddied, but they're trying to make different points at different times. And I think my sense is that on a whole lot of levels, we're doing everything we can to understand and meet and assuage the concerns of our partners without, and at the same time, try to move forward with a policy that embraces change, and change always makes people nervous.
Okay, great. We have a little bit less than 30 minutes. I am told that there's a hard end to this session. The organizers are trying to enhance the dictatorial powers of the moderator. I'm going to start up here in the front. I want to do. I'm going to do a round of questions, so I'm going to take 2 or 3. I'm going to start here with this gentleman in the very front, and then move to the lady right behind, and then maybe move over to this other table. But let's start right here.
Larry Wurzel, I'm from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Elaine, I can think of no greater threat to the stability of decades of nuclear verification and understandings about the use of nuclear weapons than conventionally prompt global strike. And that leaves out China, which doesn't have the verification means yet and has huge sensitivity over having things pass over their airspace that may contain conventional or nuclear weapons, and that it becomes far worse if they're coming out of nowhere from ballistic missile subs. So I wonder how you and any of the other panelists, although Brad tangentially addressed it, intend to retain this tacit understanding about what constitutes warning and the need to respond to ballistic missile launches as you promote this regime. And I haven't read your study, but I have had to wrestle with this stuff, and that's really my question.
Okay.
I'm Amy Wolf from the Congressional Research Service. I have a point to make on something Elaine said about continuity of support for prompt global strike across administrations. And then I have a question for all three of the panelists, which I think you've all touched on that I think might help if we clarify. Elaine mentioned that prompt global strike must be a really great idea because two administrations that are vastly different both support it. I would argue you should be cautious about that because one could say two administrations support it, or one could say a very small number of people who have worked for both administrations supported it under both administrations, which is probably far more true than worrying about who's been in the White House. There just aren't that many of us who pay any attention to the program, and none of us have moved seats yet, and two of the supporters of the program are leaving the Pentagon this month. So I'd be more willing to see how it comes out after that. So I'd just be careful in the bureaucratic politics. My question goes to what the allies really think, what the Asian allies in particular really think about what we're doing here in terms of deterring, assuring, reassuring, extended deterrence. In the Nuclear Posture Review, there was a great deal of discussion, also in the QDR, about regional deterrence strategies. And the way to reduce the role of nuclear weapons is to build a more multifaceted deterrent strategy that uses missile defense and conventional weapons and prompt global strike as a bigger basket of things to assure your allies that you have their back if things go wrong. And we, in the deterrence and arms control and nuclear weapons community in Washington over the last 2-3 years, have gotten really used to thinking about deterrence as a bigger basket of tools. Does that make the allies nervous that we don't really have their backs because we may not be quite as willing to use nuclear weapons? Or does that comfort them because we now have a bigger basket of tools that may be more credible? And I'm asking that honestly, I really don't know, so it would be helpful.
That's a very good question. Let's take one more question. I was going to try to save we've got several Japanese questioners who I want to group together in the next round. So let me go over here, and then following that, we're going to have a Japanese round, I think, the way it's shaping up.
I'm Jim Bonomo from the RAND Corporation, and I wanted to ask a question about both nuclear and conventional deterrence. It seems to me that those are terribly weakened, whoever we're trying to reassure, when they are perceived to have failed, of course. But don't we have to be quite explicit, and I didn't hear much discussion about that from the panelists, explicit on what it is we are deterring? Attacks on cities are one thing, but is an attack on a ship or a collision at sea or an economic embargo or a cyber attack what we intend to deter? So that if we fail, as Clark mentioned in one of his notes, that's a failure of deterrence? Where are we in explaining to our allies, to our public, to ourselves, what it is we are deterring here?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially in this context. Why don't we start with Brad, and then we'll do it in reverse order this time.
Thanks a lot. I'll just look very quickly at two questions. The last one, and the answer is obviously yes, we have to be explicit on deterrence, and I think, truthfully, we got a long ways to go. I mean, that's precisely when we talk about deterrence as shaping, and that we're dealing with a wider range of events that are potentially seen as hostile, then nuclear weapons or any military capability doesn't do you a whole lot of good when your issue is rare earth embargoes. So clearly the issue for our allies is the sense of connection. And in that case, it's the renewed sense of commitment that comes from an incredibly broad array of political and military factors, sometimes which actual weapons capabilities don't even enter into the conversation. Nevertheless, I mean, the best people to talk to are our allies in the room. The degree to which they feel comforted by U.S. capabilities, we have to make sure that they understand what those capabilities are out there for and when we're going to use them, and that they're comfortable with all of those. And that's a really lousy answer, and I hope Clark can come up with a better one. To Amy's question about are they worried about this broader basket? Sometimes. I mean, I think quite simply sometimes they want to know that we got a hammer and that we're not reluctant to use it. But I think a more sophisticated approach, and I say that with some people that actually shape Japanese thinking about deterrence and the alliance in the room, I'm hoping they will get the message that having this broader array, I think, is stronger for the alliance. They shouldn't be nervous, but nevertheless, there is a great deal of insecurity that sometimes tends to be what I would consider to be irrational. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Julie?
On Larry Wurzel's question about concerns of Russia, China seeing something that's normally nuclear coming their way. Well, the ballistic missile sub that you cited, that option's off the table. Probably the only near-term option. That's off the table. But no matter whether or not we do conventional prompt global strike, we need some mechanisms for confidence-building measures, for pre-launch notifications, whether it's for missile defense boosters that look a lot like ballistic missiles, whether it's for CPGS boost glide. We need some mechanisms for picking up the phone and saying, something's going on in Iran. It's not about you. They will have, and it depends on what's going on with each of those actors, and that would factor into a president's decision on whether or not to use these in any given scenario. It doesn't. If tensions are high with those two major powers, you might choose not to use that. However, the fact that they will have watched tests and exercises of this, if we ever go forward with deployment, they will have watched that. Hopefully you'll put in place some notification, confidence-building measures. There has already been experience of systems which used to be only nuclear that are now nuclear and conventional. Bombers, B-52s, B-2s, they were originally just nuclear. No one blinks an eye now when they're deployed to theaters for conventional operations. So it is an issue that is serious and it needs to be worked, but I don't find it to be insurmountable. Amy, on the across two administrations, yes, there certainly are people who cross administrations, but it was specifically called out in the NPR, which was approved at the presidential level. So I don't, there's all kind of bureaucratic politics to this, but I continue to say, and in my article, there's 3 pages on what each administration has said about this, so I'm not backing down on that one. On tailored regional deterrence strategies and whether allies are nervous about our making for a bigger basket, I will be very interested to hear the next round of questions, so whether that's true or not. In 1997, I recall when we were having discussions with the Japanese on missile defense before they decided to go forward on it. I remember a meeting in Colorado Springs where my role was to give a briefing to say, basically, we are not pulling the extended nuclear deterrence rug out from under you. That's not why we're encouraging you to do missile defense. So again, you'll have to. I'd like to hear from our Japanese and Korean colleagues about whether they are nourished or not. Jim, and your question about, I wish I could read my writing, Jim. Where are we on the discussion of what are we trying to deter? I think we aren't very far along in that discussion. I mean, I think because I have heard Korean colleagues say, well, Chonan happened, Yongpyong shelling happened, therefore deterrence failed. Therefore, what good is extended deterrence? And I guess my response is to say, look at all the things that didn't happen, but in the Cold War, you don't deter everything. And so focusing on what we really want to try to deter, where do we want our deterrence efforts to be? What capabilities do allies bring to deterrence, whether that's in better naval capabilities, Chonan sinking, whether it's other capabilities that allies bring to bear, and that's what they want to focus on. And so I guess it's kind of the continued discussion that I hope the Extended Deterrence Policy Committee with Korea and the similar discussions that go on with Japan, though I don't think they have a little name that goes with them, but they've been occurring too about what is extended deterrence, what is it that we're trying, that's the basis of them. It's who are we worried about, what are we worried about they're doing, where do we want to focus our deterrence efforts, what do each of us bring to the table to do that, how do we deal with it? And so I think those conversations have begun, but I don't think that they've settled on those issues yet.
I think I'd probably go a little further than Lane would on this one. And I'll start with the last question. Is in the bad old days of the Cold War, we used to talk about Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 deterrence, minor provocations, major provocations, direct attacks. The United States doesn't worry too much about direct attacks, deterring direct attacks by itself. We worry a lot more about the range of things that can be done against our allies and partners and interests abroad during that time. And I would argue that if you're going to what we used to call minor provocations, what may seem minor to the United States isn't necessarily minor to our allies. And I take again the sinking of the Shannon. Pretty major, I would say, to the North Koreans, to the South Koreans. And the response to that was tepid at most. And led to another, I would argue, you can talk about indirectly and stuff, but certainly the risk-taking propensity of the North Koreans was not reduced by our reaction at Shannon. So then you had the shelling of Yongpyong. And I would argue then that pressure started to ratchet up. This is a reaction of the alliance, a greater trilateral reaction with Secretary Clinton hosting a meeting of her counterparts in Washington to signal considerable concern, greater cooperation, U.S.-Japanese exercises attended by the South Koreans, U.S.-Korean exercises attended by the Japanese, increased statements of solidarity. Did they make an Article 5-like commitment in NATO? That, no. But the basic security relation, responding to it, and more importantly, I would argue, is greater pressure upon the Chinese to say, maybe you have to do something about this particular state that you have more leverage over than we did. One of the things that I think we can argue in terms of parsing out, who made what trip where, why didn't the North Koreans respond to the second why didn't the North Koreans respond to the second South Korean response to that shelling? This is an alliance thing. I think it's basically our allies, in particular Japan and South Korea, want the United States and want themselves to bring the biggest bundle of capabilities to it. There is no question that when responding to minor provocations, You have to have prompt responses, they're proportionate responses that indicate that the will of those who have been attacked is strong. That's something that can be done promptly and conventionally at an appropriate level. The nuclear is far, far removed from that. It's all about the will of the alliance. And in this particular case, it's also, when you made the issue of deterring, I would argue that in the case that we're talking about right here, is that we're trying to deter provocations from the North Koreans by convincing them that there'll be responses. And we're also trying to send a message to the Chinese saying, if you do not take greater responsibility for the actions of this state that is acting in an undisciplined way, we will react in such ways that you will not like it. And that message was communicated as well. So it depends upon the situation. And I think that sort of answered your question as well, in terms of, I think the most important thing that our allies look for is the capabilities to be sure, but the will to use those capabilities appropriate to the circumstances involved. Now, have we done anything? Yesterday there was a mention of Chinese muscle flexing in the areas. Picked up the International Herald Tribune today. Today was Vietnam was upset because of actions the Chinese have been taking on Spratly Islands. Last week it was the Philippines. Secretary Clinton made it clear that the United States believes in the peaceful resolution of territorial conflicts. We haven't solved that problem. Would I say there's been a failure of deterrence? Well, I'm not sure we put deterrence down at that level. But I certainly think it's something that concerns our allies and concerns us as well.
Okay, in this, we're going to move to the second round of questions, during which I expect we're going to find out something about the credibility of the assurances the panel has offered so far, because I'd like to focus on questions from Japan and South Korea. So we'll go to this table right here. There are a number of people who have their hands up.
We only have 15 minutes, so.
Okay. I'm Tomohiro Okamoto, the member of ERI, Eurasian Research Institute of Japan. I was a former Lieutenant General, retired from Air Self-Defense Force. And 1 month ago, Admiral Willard mentioned about the threat of the F-21 Delta. And this is an asset of mainland China of ballistic missile without nuclear. So in that sense, this is a threat from not the nuclear, but the conventional. But speed is very rapid. Only 45 minutes from mainland China to direct to the group of aircraft carrier. Aircraft carriers, a group of aircraft carrier composed of more than 6,000 personnel, included 100 fighters as well. It's a big, high-value target. How do you defend? Do you still give up the ballistic missile to use a conventional type of attack? My question goes to Elena.
Okay, that's a great question.
And also, the second, if
the second one.
China might be tempted to use nuclear because the aircraft carrier is very, very high value. So if the conventional type is not so effective, then they might change to the warhead to nuclear. What's happened? So you have to start a negotiation with mainland China how to use this so-called anti-ship ballistic missile. This is my question.
Okay, great. Any other, especially Japanese or Korean colleagues? Yeah, we got the other side of the table.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Noboru Yamaguchi, teaching at National Defense Academy of Japan after retiring from the GSDF. And my comment is that on the audience, particular audience, extended side, the three audience, deterring side and deterred side and extended side. Now my perception on extended side relies on not only weapons but much more things, a wider range of things. For instance, 1 year and a half ago, we used to ask lots of questions about credibility of U.S. extended deterrence. Since Obama administration was going to reduce nuclear the warheads, and we are not sure the Obama administration is committed to the region. But after NPR and QDR, BMDR were released, Japanese experts got much more relaxed because it was declared by the administration. U.S. was committed to the extended deterrence. And furthermore, after the 3/11, when the Ronald Reagan and 18 other naval vessels deployed offshore Japan, almost nobody asked a question about credibility of the deterrence. U.S. is with us, and Ronald Reagan, watching the Ronald Reagan light offshore of Tohoku suffering area, nobody asked a question. I think that psychology is a very important aspect of the, particularly credibility of the extended deterrence. So when we see the more political will of the U.S. to commit itself to the region or to the security of Japan or the surrounding region, we are much more eased, relaxed about the credibility. So now I shall say that nobody is asking question whether the U.S. extended deterrence is credible. We are at the high tide of the credibility of the extended deterrence. Thank you.
That's great.
I'm Suyo Takashi from Japanese MOD. I have this time a short question, short comment. Since yesterday we discussed both assurance and deterrence is important for extended deterrence. And we need to make effort in the both context for assurance and deterrence. My question is, do you think there are any possibility of some trade-off of the assurance and the deterrence? One major assurance can deteriorate to deterrence and the vice versa. That's my question. And I have a short comment on the CPGS implication on extended deterrence. I think the CPGS, physical implication of CPGS is very neutral or reinforce the extended deterrence. However, if U.S. talked with Russia, China about pre-launch notification without enough consultation with Japan, that could have some negative implication of extended deterrence, especially in the assurance side. So in that sense, political something is necessary to assurance in the context of CPGS. That's my comment.
Okay, do we have any other questions? This will be the last one, right up here in the front.
Thank you. Young Chon of Seoul Asian University. I'd like to ask to Dr. Murdoch. You mentioned about the risk-taking of North Korea. But in a sense, I think it's more than just risk-taking, because North Korea are fully aware of America's deep involvement in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Middle East nowadays. So they will calculate that kind of situation. I think Kim Jong-il is no longer able to control fully its own military, unlike his father. So North Korea knows Americans is not going to threaten North Korea with nuclear. And South Korea also worry about our economy. So they have multiple reasons why they should behave that way. And it can happen again. How could the United States or South Korea together prevent this kind of war situation? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to return to our panelists for some last comments and responses to those questions. And I give each of them 2 minutes. And I think this time I'll start with Elaine, and we'll just work our way down.
With regard to Okamata-san's point, yes, indeed, while the U.S. is considering CPGS, there are others in the world who do have already conventional ballistic missiles. Admiral Willard has said, on the DF-21, I would point out that Admiral Willard has said that this will not affect, that the U.S. will continue to deploy to the region. I would, with Yamaguchi-san's excellent point, I would agree with you that the overall health of the alliance is much more important, I think, than any specific weapon capability. And so all the things that you cited that have helped assure Japan, that's part of the overall health of the and relationship of and cooperation in the alliance. Takahashi-san, I would agree with you that as strategic on CPGS and whether it helps or hurts extended deterrence, that consultations with Japan and Korea will be essential as strategic stability dialogues with China move forward.
I think the only thing I would add would be that if we have in fact entered a new strategic era in which the United States, the world works differently. I think our attention to Asia has changed permanently. And I think that there is a growing sense in the U.S. government, at least, and maybe it's just because I live in Hawaii and that's where I focus, but I get the sense now that the U.S. understands the need to talk to our allies in Asia first, and that's where we begin the conversations, and that we need to be sensitive, and perhaps we haven't been sensitive in the past. That, as well as new geopolitical realities, demand that we do it, and I think we will. So, and then as for the question about the DF-21, we don't have to worry because China has a no first use doctrine, right?
I'll stay within 5 minutes. You can put the sign down. I agree with Elaine that the overall health of the alliance, the security commitments are the most important single thing. You need to have capabilities to be sure, because an alliance without capabilities can't act in the way that it speaks. And when you're talking about deterrence and when you're talking about assurance, actions always speak louder than words. Empty words, whether it's by our allies or by ourselves, always come back and bite us during that time. So I would argue that while our reaction to Shannon was not a good one, our reaction in late November and early December of last year to the continued provocations from North Korea and the lack of action on the part of China to do anything about that resulted in more uniform, coherent actions from the United States, Japan, and South Korea, and the crisis eased. Does it mean it's over? No. It'll happen again. Because as you point out quite accurately, there are many reasons for why North Koreans engage in provocative actions. I think Yongbyon, for example, was just an instance where they'd done Shannon and nobody paid any attention to them, so they did something else. Because they want to get themselves back onto the center of attention. The Obama administration engaged in a policy saying, we're going to ignore North Korea. Strategic patience, it was called. Because they said that they're trying to clamor for attention. We won't give them the attention. We're not going to give them, we're not going to negotiate with ourselves. We're not going to give them any benefits. Well, the United States engaged in, quote, strategic patience, and it led to another provocation because maybe there's some kind of Zhang Il or whoever it is that's making the decisions there. If they go a certain period of time without world attention, they do something to get more world attention. So it's an ongoing, constant struggle to deal with adversaries like North Korea, who are capable of very erratic behavior that we don't fully understand. Deterrence is hard with those kind of adversaries, so it's rapid responses, it's proportional responses, it's Pavlovian. You know, you train animals by immediate, consistent responses. That's what you have to do when you're dealing with adversaries like North Korea during that time. And that depends, again, back onto the basic soundness and firmness of the security alliance. You use the capabilities that are appropriate to the challenges at hand, but you talk with your allies and you act in concert, and you will more likely be successful than you won't.
Okay, well, I want to thank our audience. We're going to end, I guess, a minute or two early. I'm afraid to open it back up for fear that I'll lose control. But I want to thank our audience for good questions, and I want to have everybody thank our panelists with a round of applause. And then I have one announcement that I've been asked to make about our closed networking lunch at designated restaurants around Seoul. For those who have registered, the buses are going to be outside the first floor lobby entrance, and you're asked to get on the bus with the letter that matches the one on the back of your conference ID badge. And I've noticed that the organizers are very smart about this. They listed the names of the topics of the sessions rather than the restaurants. So good luck.